Hi there, and welcome to Out There, a Cryptid podcast. I'm Josh, and today we're going to sink our teeth into the bloody history and modern mystery of vampires in New Orleans, a city where shadows stretch long, secrets linger behind shuttered windows, and legends never truly die. Let's dive in. This October, we're doing something special. Every week, we'll be exploring the strange, the haunted, and the downright unexplainable stories that come out of New Orleans. From ghosts and vampires to curses and mysteries, the Crescent City has no shortage of tales that blur the line between folklore and reality. So, all month long, we're investigating the shadows of New Orleans, the perfect place for spooky season. We'll get into the vampires of New Orleans right after this. The French Quarter at night is alive more than music. Gas lamps flicker against crumbling walls, wrought iron balconies cast long shadows, and whispers seem to follow you through the narrow streets. It's the perfect backdrop for one of New Orleans' darkest legends, the vampire. While the city is celebrated for its history, beauty, and endless parties, it may surprise you to learn that it also holds another title, the vampire capital of America. We're not going to go completely in depth with the history of vampires, that could easily fill an entire episode on its own, and will, but to understand why New Orleans became such a hotspot for vampire legends, we need to touch on where the story begins. The idea of blood-drinking creatures is ancient. In Mesopotamia, there was the demoness Lamashtu, who preyed on infants and pregnant women. The Greeks told stories of Lamia, a cursed woman who fed on the blood of children. And in Eastern Europe, people feared the Strigoi, restless spirits said to rise from their graves and feed on the living. Over time, these myths blended together into what we now recognize as the vampire archetype: pale, nocturnal, sustained by blood, and feared for their ability to blur the line between the life and death. By the 1700s, vampire panic had spread through Eastern Europe. Villagers reported strange deaths, and when graves were opened, bodies sometimes appeared fresh, with blood at their mouths. People drove stakes through corpses, burned bodies, and decapitated the dead to prevent them from rising again. These tales traveled quickly, inspiring both fear and fascination. And by the time Gothic literature took off in the 18th and 19th centuries, the vampire had become a staple of horror. Eventually, those stories crossed the ocean and sank their teeth into America, where they found especially fertile ground in New Orleans. So, why New Orleans? Why did vampire legends take root here more than anywhere else in America? It starts with the city's foundation. From the very beginning, New Orleans was layered with cultures, faiths, and folklore. The French and Spanish brought Catholicism, with its rituals, saints, and strict rules about life and death. Catholicism already carried an air of the supernatural: relics that held power, holy water to ward off evil, crucifix that could repel darkness. It was fertile ground for vampire legends, where a wooden cross wasn't just a symbol of faith, but a weapon against the undead. Then came the influence of enslaved Africans and Caribbean people, who brought with them a spiritual worldview deeply rooted in ancestral spirits, protection charms, and powerful deities. These beliefs merged into what we know now, today, as voodoo. In New Orleans, voodoo was never fully separate from Catholicism. they blended together, creating a system of faith where candles, saints, spells, and spirits could all exist side by side. Meanwhile, Creole traditions, born from the intermingling of French, Spanish, African, and Native American cultures, added even more depth. Folklore and Creole communities often blurred the line between myth and lived experience, treating spirits and monsters as part of everyday life. Now, add in the city's geography. As a port city, New Orleans was constantly receiving ships from around the world. With each wave of newcomers came new stories: Eastern European vampire tales, French Gothic romances, Caribbean spirits, and African myths. These stories didn't just stay isolated. They mixed, adapted, and took root in the damp, haunted soil of Louisiana. And then there's the city itself. The sweltering heat, the fog that rolls in from the Mississippi, and cemeteries filled with above-ground tombs, sometimes cracked open by floods. All gave New Orleans a natural air of death and decay. For locals, it wasn't hard to imagine something walking out of those crypts at night. So, in New Orleans, old-world vampire myths didn't just survive, they evolved. But before we get into the sightings, I think it's worth laying out some of the classic rules of vampires, the traits that have carried through folklore for centuries and still show up in pop culture today. These are the details that make the stories feel connected, whether they're coming out of Eastern Europe in the 1700s or off TikTok last week. The big one is the invitation rule. Vampires can't enter a home, or sometimes even a building, unless they're invited in. That comes up a lot, and honestly, it's one of the earliest things to hear echoed in modern stories. Then there's the sunlight. Depending on which version you're looking at, it either weakens them or destroys them completely, which is why they're creatures of the night. Immortality is another constant. They don't age, they don't wither, they just keep going. And of course, the obvious one, they drink blood. Other details pop up over and over too: glowing or unusual eyes, sharp teeth, sometimes even jagged or animal-like. Old legends say they could shapeshift into bats, wolves, even mist. They're almost always unnaturally fast or strong, able to overpower a human without much effort. And then you've got the protections and weapons: holy symbols, crosses, blessed water, and of course, the classic stake through the heart. Some of these details feel like old superstitions, but others often slip into modern accounts. The most famous vampire tale in New Orleans began with a convent, a shipment of young women, and a series of coffin-shaped chests. In the early 1700s, New Orleans was a rough and dangerous port city. There were more men than women, and officials worried about stability. To balance things out, the French crown and the Catholic Church arranged to send young women across the Atlantic to marry colonists and start families. These girls became known as the filles cassettes, or casket girls, because of the small wooden chests, or cassettes, they carried with them. Now, despite the name, these caskets weren't coffins. They were modest travel trunks, just large enough to hold clothing, a Bible, maybe a few personal belongings. But to the superstitious eye, they looked eerily like coffins. And in a city already brimming with vampire whispers, that resemblance mattered. When the casket girls arrived in New Orleans in the 1720s, they were housed at the Old Ursuline Convent on Chartres Street, under the care of the Ursuline nuns. Local rumors quickly spread. People whispered that the girls seemed pale and frail, almost unnaturally so after their long voyage. Some said they rarely appeared during the day. Combined with the coffin-like chests, the gossip practically wrote itself. These young women were carrying vampires into the New World. The story takes a darker turn with what happened to their luggage. After the girls were married off, their chests were taken into the attic of the Ursuline convent for storage. Legend claims that when the chests were later opened, they were found completely empty, except for traces of blood. Fearing what might be inside, the nuns supposedly nailed the attic windows shut, using nails blessed by the Pope himself, to ensure whatever evil had been brought over could never escape. To this day, ghost tours in the French Quarter point to the convent and tell visitors to look up. The attic shutters, they say, remain permanently closed. Some guides insist that any time work crews have tried to open them, tragedy soon followed. A few even claim that the nails keeping the shutters sealed are still holy nails, blessed by Rome. The historical reality, of course, is less dramatic. The Ursuline convent is indeed one of the oldest surviving buildings in the city, dating back to the mid-1700s. The attic shutters were likely kept shut simply to protect the building from the elements. But that hasn't stopped generations of locals, tourists, and storytellers from adding layers to the vampire legend. Some paranormal enthusiasts swear the convent is still a hotspot for strange activity. One story tells a pair of curious investigators in the 1970s who pried open the attic windows one night. The next morning, their bodies were found drained of blood in the convent's courtyard. Even today, the convent is a staple of New Orleans vampire lore. Tour guide Sidney Smith once remarked, quote, "You can't tell the story of vampires in this city without pointing to those shutters. They've been closed for centuries, and people will always wonder why." End quote. And it still creeps into modern New Orleans. One maintenance worker tasked with inspecting the attic reportedly refused to go inside, claiming an overwhelming sense of dread and the unmistakable feeling of being watched. Visitors and locals have reported seeing ghostly figures or even glowing eyes staring from the shuttered windows at night. Whether it's superstition, imagination, or something else entirely, the convent continues to carry an eerie presence, keeping the story of the Casket Girls alive for anyone willing to look up. So, whether the Casket Girls were simply homesick French brides or carriers of something far more sinister, their legend has sunk deep into the veins of New Orleans, giving the city one of its most enduring vampire mysteries. More on the vampires of New Orleans right after this. Now, that was one of many vampire legends of this city, but by far, the Casket Girls is the least terrifying. Take the Carter brothers, for example. In 1930s, John and Wayne Carter were rumored to prey on vagrants in the French Quarter, luring them into their apartment under the guise of offering food and shelter, only for the victims to vanish. Now, the Carter brothers were reportedly longshoremen working along the Mississippi in New Orleans during the early 1930s. Their apartment, located at the corner of Royal and St. Anne Streets, became the focal point of a chilling tale that would haunt the French Quarter for years. According to local lore, a young girl managed to escape from their apartment and ran to the authorities, claiming she had been held captive and drained of blood. When police raided the apartment, they allegedly found 4 other victims, still alive but in critical condition, bound and drained of blood. The brothers were captured and executed for their crimes. However, when the tomb intended to house their remains was opened years later, their bodies were reportedly missing, fueling rumors that they had never truly died. Some accounts even suggest that sightings of the brothers continue in the French Quarter, with individuals resembling them appearing on balconies or disappearing into the night. Then there's the mysterious Jacques Saint-Germain, a Frenchman who appeared in New Orleans in the early 1900s and quickly became part of high society. He was known for hosting lavish dinner parties, though he never ate himself, and for wandering the streets at night, often in the company of young women. Rumor has it that a woman once fled his home claiming she had been bitten on the neck, and when the police searched his residence, they found bottles of wine mixed with blood. Yet, Saint Germain had vanished without a trace. Adding to the mystery, he was said to be related to the legendary European Count de Saint Germain, a man who supposedly lived for centuries without aging, which only cemented his reputation as an immortal vampire. To this day, people claim Jacques still wanders the streets, always dressed to match the times, and if you happen to stare too long, legend says he'll meet your eyes, and with a knowing smile, maybe a wink or even a tip of his hat, remind you that he's been here far longer than you can imagine. Part of what fuels these stories is the city itself. New Orleans' above-ground cemeteries, with their ornate crypts and tombs, provide the perfect setting for the undead. The idea that vampires could rest in these miniature houses by day and emerge under the cover of night has long captured the imagination of locals and tourists alike. Over time, these tombs have not only inspired countless ghost stories, but have also become iconic symbols of the city's unique, haunting character, making New Orleans feel like the perfect home for vampire legends. But of course, no discussion of New Orleans vampires would be complete without Anne Rice. Rice, the acclaimed author of Interview with the Vampire, is often credited with shaping modern vampire lore. Her novel, published in 1976, introduced readers to the brooding vampire, Louis de Pont-de-Lac, and his charismatic maker, Lestat de Liancourt. Set against the haunting backdrop of New Orleans, the story delves into themes of immortality, morality, and the human condition. While Rice has acknowledged that her personal experiences, particularly the grief from losing her daughter, influenced her writing, there's an intriguing claim that adds an eerie layer to her inspiration. According to reports, Rice met a man who introduced himself as Lestat, the very name of her fictional vampire. This encounter allegedly provided her with the foundation story of her novel. Some even suggest that Rice believed this man was a real vampire. Even filmmaker Neil Jordan, who directed the 1994 film adaptation, reportedly told a colleague that Rice had confided in him that Lestat was a real vampire, and that the first book was based on her experience with him. Her stories blurred the line between fiction and reality. That line has only gotten blurrier in recent years because now people aren't just reading about vampires in books. They're claiming to meet them. On TikTok, in late-night confessionals, modern witnesses are stepping forward to share their own eerie encounters. One of the most chilling modern encounters comes from the TikTok creator Ashlyn Inc., who shares spooky, scary story time. On her page, she tells a story sent to her by two sisters, Ness and Jen, who were out celebrating Fat Tuesday in New Orleans. They crossed paths with a man who immediately stood out. He was light-skinned, dressed in an Eagles hoodie, and his piercing green eyes seemed to draw people in. Ness described those eyes as mesmerizing, the kind you can't quite look away from. The sisters chatted with him for a while. They moved on to another venue, but strangely, he always seemed to reappear. Bar after bar, no matter where they went, there he was. And every single time before stepping inside with them, he would stop and ask, "Do you want me to come in?" It was Mardi Gras. Anyone could just walk in whether they wanted to, or not. Yet, he waited for their permission each time. Jen always waved him along, but the details stuck with them later. As the night wound down and the crowd thinned, the man offered to walk them back to their hotel. It felt gentlemanly enough, so they agreed. On the way, right in the middle of the street, he took Jen's hand and pulled her into a slow dance. Between the music still echoing in the distance and the alcohol in their systems, the whole moment felt dreamlike, until he leaned in, teeth grazing her neck, and he was about to bite. Jen pulled back quickly, telling him she wasn't looking for that kind of thing, and in that instant, both sisters noticed something eerie. Maybe it was just the streetlight, but they swore his face seemed to shift. When they reached the hotel, he asked once more, "May I come in?" Both women felt a cold shiver run through them. Jen, finally snapping out of the haze, told him firmly, "No," and with that, the man turned, walked away silently, and disappeared into the night. When they looked back down the street just moments later, he was gone. No trace of him at all. Later, when they thought back on it, it wasn't just his behavior that unnerved them. His sharp, almost exaggerated canines, the constant need for an invitation, and an attempt to bite Jen instead of kissing her, and one cryptic comment he made earlier that night. "I lived here longer than you can imagine." All of it pointed to something far stranger than just a weird Mardi Gras encounter. Another TikToker named Tiff's Ghost Talk shared a completely different story that really scared a lot of her followers. She starts it off by saying, "If an Airbnb in New Orleans gives you a warning, you should probably take it seriously." For the sake of the story, she calls her Kate. Kate was in town for a business trip and didn't want to stay in a hotel. She always felt uneasy in them, and they were less safe, so she booked this cute little Airbnb near the French Quarter. When she arrived, everything seemed normal. She got in with her code, and the host had left a handwritten note with the unusual instructions. Make yourself at home, clean up after yourself, all that. But at the bottom, there was a strange warning. Do not open the door after midnight for anyone. Kate figured it was just a joke about the nightlife and didn't take it seriously. The first night passed without incident, but on the second night, just after 12:45, she heard 3 soft knocks at the door. They weren't frantic or loud, just polite, almost too polite. Looking through the peephole, she saw a man standing there. He was strikingly handsome, pale skin, dark hair, and piercing eyes. He told her he was sorry to bother her, but he had left his phone inside a few days ago. Kate thought it was odd. She hadn't seen any phone in the place, but he insisted he could tell her exactly where it was. She didn't need to let him in, she could just grab it for him. She couldn't quite hear that last thing he said, and without thinking, she cracked the door open just a little. That's when he smiled, winked, and said, "Thank you. That's all I needed." Then he turned and left. The next morning, Kate was getting ready for her meeting. After her shower, she noticed the mirror in the bathroom had fogged up, and written in the steam, clear as day, was one word: invited. Still, she didn't panic. She even wondered if it was some local gimmick, so she called the host to ask. The host said, "Did you open the door?" When Kate admitted she had, just a crack, the host hung up without another word. That night, things escalated. As Kate lay in bed near the window, she heard 3 soft knocks again, this time against the glass. Shadows moved across the room, and she swore she saw that same man watching her from outside. He never entered, but the sense of being hunted was overwhelming. By morning, she had packed her bags and left the Airbnb for good. But according to Kate, it didn't end there. Even after returning home, she claims that sometimes around the same time each night, she still hears 3 faint knocks, with no one on the other side. New Orleans vampire sightings aren't limited to TikTok tales. Beyond the short clips and viral stories, there's an entire underground of eyewitness accounts shared by locals and visitors alike. People who have posted their experiences on forums and Reddit, recounting encounters that range from eerie to downright unexplainable. Let's dive into some of these first-hand stories, where the line between legend and reality gets even blurrier. On the Ask Nola subreddit, a user named Scarlet Fever X posted that she was heading to the city for the first time and had heard whispers about a secret vampire bar, the kind of place where you need a password to enter. She asked the community what all the hype was about, whether there were real vampires in the city, and if the bar was as mysterious and exclusive as she had heard. Another user, Wielder of the Darkness, responded with a compilation of eyewitness accounts, stories from people who claimed to have had encounters with individuals they believed to be vampires, and even experiences inside these elusive, password-protected bars. One story comes from a Reddit user who shared an account involving a woman we'll call Angie. Angie had traveled to New Orleans for a long weekend with her husband's family. One evening, while they were at a restaurant, Angie stepped outside briefly to get something from the car. What happened next was straight out of a vampire legend. As another family member approached to check on her, she noticed a man standing near Angie. At first, it seemed like a normal conversation, maybe even a hug, but as she got closer, she saw his face, and his mouth filled with jagged teeth. Before anyone could react, the man suddenly shot straight up into the air and vanished. Angie herself didn't remember any of this. The last thing she recalls is walking toward the car. Concerned, the family called the police. When asked if the man had been tall with amber-colored eyes, the answer was yes. And according to the officers, this was a known phenomenon in New Orleans. Not the kind of goth kids with fangs you might expect, but allegedly with real, supernatural abilities. What makes this story stick isn't just the flying vampire or the sharp teeth. It's that even locals claim these sightings happen. A whispered secret of the city that only surfaces when visitors brush too close to its shadows. Stories like Angie's aren't just limited to locals. Visitors of New Orleans have had their own spine-tingling encounters. Take another Redditor who shared their experience from back in 2001. They were just 14 at the time and visiting in the city for their birthday. A big Anne Rice fan and obsessed with vampires, they decided to take a stroll along the Riverwalk one evening, and quickly got the feeling they weren't alone. Feeling watched, they hurried back toward the hotel with their dad, only to spot a man walking alongside the street. His coat flared dramatically as he moved, long hair tied back, and he was dressed oddly for the summer night. Elegant, almost timeless. At first, their dad joked about he must be a vampire, but the encounter quickly turned unnerving. The man smiled at them, and the Redditor recalls an immediate sense of doom, a feeling of being prey. Then, the impossible happened. As they drove to get a closer look, the man suddenly flew up into the sky and out of sight. Both the Redditor and their father, a skeptic who doesn't believe in the supernatural, saw it happen. Pale face, glowing eyes, and that locked gaze. The experience left them both shaken and unsure if what they had seen was a ghost, a vampire, or something else entirely. Encounters like the one along the Riverwalk aren't always just fleeting glimpses. Sometimes they linger, mysterious and transformative. Another Redditor shared a story from their honeymoon in New Orleans a few years ago that reads more like a supernatural intervention than a tourist anecdote. They were walking from the Marigny toward the French Quarter when they noticed a tall, striking man leaning against a storefront, a dog at his side. At first, he seemed like any other passerby, but the moment they spoke, something felt off. He addressed them directly, his gaze intense, warning them not to invite things over lightly. There was a sense of weight, almost a psychic presence in the air, as he continued the conversation, speaking to both the Redditor and their husband. Then, the truly strange part. He asked about the necklace they were wearing, a handmade tree of life, and after a brief exchange, touched both of them over the third eye, saying he had balanced their energies. It was unsettling, almost ritualistic, but left a tangible effect. The woman noticed his eyes, bright red, not reflective like normal eyes, but irises that matched her own. Before walking away, he even called out, "By the way, I never wash my hands." A strange, almost playful warning. By the end of the day, the couple felt subtle, physical tingling from the touch, and over the following week, their relationship began to shift in a positive way. Her husband doesn't recall any of the spiritual elements, but the strange encounter with this imposing man stayed. And even now, she's left wondering who or what exactly did they meet that day in New Orleans. And finally, some encounters in New Orleans aren't just fleeting glimpses or eerie feelings. Sometimes they're full-on, unexplainable experiences that feel like stepping into a vampire storybook. One Redditor recounted a trip to NOLA when they were 17, staying at the historic Le Pavillon Hotel with two friends. They spent the night bar hopping in the French Quarter, soaking up the 90s vampire and goth scene, dancing, drinking, and letting the energy of the city sweep them away. At one of the bars, they met a local girl named Victoria, who warned them to be careful around a mysterious guy named Leo. Nobody seemed to know exactly where he came from. He had been around for a few months, and there was something about him that made the native girl uneasy. Despite the warning, the Redditor got close to Leo, and the night became increasingly surreal. At one point, Leo leapt over a balcony railing, not falling, but landing on the street below, then disappeared from sight. Confused but unafraid, the Redditor kept following him, experiencing moments of lost time and strange sensations, including brief, biting encounters, before waking up hours later, blocks away, utterly exhausted. The story ends in a jaw-dropping moment back at the hotel. Leaning against a window, they suddenly saw Leo seemingly flying past, only to vanish instantly. The next night, attempts to find him or Victoria yielded nothing, as if they never existed. Encounters like this blur the line between the real and the supernatural, leaving those who experience them questioning exactly what they saw. These Reddit stories are fascinating because they come from everyday people, tourists, honeymooners, teenagers out for a night of fun, not professional storytellers. And yet, the details echo each other. Strange eyes, the need for an invitation, that eerie feeling of being prey, even vanishing into the night. Whether you take them at face value or chalk them up to overreactive imaginations, they reveal just how alive the vampire legend is in New Orleans today. But why do these stories persist? Why are people still so obsessed with vampires, not just in books and movies, but in real life? That brings us to the bigger question. What is it about vampire culture that continues to captivate us? And what does it say about New Orleans itself? More on the vampires of New Orleans, right after this. So, where does this leave us? Dozens of personal accounts, centuries of folklore, some shaky photos, and a handful of viral videos. It's tempting to want one clear answer. The safest explanation is the boring one. People misremembering, lights and shadows fool the eye, alcohol and adrenaline warp perception, and a city that practically markets its own mysteries. Human brains are built to tell stories and to find patterns. In New Orleans, where every balcony could host a ghost, it doesn't take much for an odd encounter to become a vampire tale. But I don't want to close the book on this either. Part of what keeps these stories alive is that a surprising amount of weirdness accompanies them. Constant details, the invitation motif glowing or unusual eyes, sudden disappearances, repeat sightings in the same neighborhoods, and sometimes even police or locals who shrug and say, "Yeah, that's been reported." So, while skepticism is healthy, curiosity is too. With folklore this persistent, you have to allow for a little mystery. Beyond the question of literal vampires, there's a second, more human story here. Why people are obsessed with vampires in the first place. Vampires are shorthand for a whole package of fears and desires: immortality, sex, power, transgression. They're outsiders who live by their own rules, who move through the night and refuse ordinary mortality. That makes them endlessly compelling. Anne Rice didn't invent New Orleans' vampire image, but she absolutely polished it and sent it glittering back into the world. And then there's the real-world vampire scene. Not monsters from folklore, but people. Across the US and in New Orleans, you will find communities of folks who identify as vampires. Some are sanguinarians. They say they have a physical need to take blood, always, importantly, consensual from donors. Others call themselves psychic or energy vampires, who believe they feed on emotional or psychic energy rather than blood. These groups often have their own etiquette and safety rules. Consent is everything, donors are voluntary adults, health precautions are emphasized, and community norms discourage them taking advantage of vulnerable people. New Orleans also has a nightlife that plays with those boundaries: private events, themed balls, and bars that cultivate secrecy and ritual. Some are purely performative: goth nights, costume balls, theatrical clubs. Others are more restrictive: networks where people who practice alternative lifestyles meet and trade stories. That blend of performance, identity, and secrecy is exactly the kind of environment that turns an odd sighting into a legend that spreads. Listen, I've been to New Orleans. I've walked those streets, felt that weird electric energy. Maybe it was Mardi Gras and the city was wound tight on the adrenaline after COVID. Or maybe the place just hums differently on some level. I don't pretend to know. What I do know is this: between the history, the cemeteries, the convent shutters, and the sheer number of constant weird reports, this is one of those rare cases where I'm inclined to believe. Not blindly, not like a convert, but enough to say, I think something is there. Vampires, as myths and metaphors and communities, have been around in one form or another for centuries. When you look at that kind of persistence, it starts to feel unlikely that everything about them is pure fiction. People are drawn to the same archetype for a reason: immortality, secrecy, power, and the temptation to live outside ordinary rules. So it doesn't surprise me that if anything like this exists, it would gravitate to a place like New Orleans, a city that already embraces the strange, the ritualistic, and the night-dwelling. It's the perfect hub. So, where do I land? I'll say this: be skeptical, but stay curious. Lock your doors at midnight, mind the attic shutters, and if someone asks whether they can come in, think twice. And if you ever find yourself standing under a balcony, and you get that prickly, hunted feeling, maybe don't shrug it off. New Orleans keeps secrets, and some of them might be older and darker than we want to admit. So, what do you think? Are the vampires of New Orleans really out there? Be sure to follow us on Instagram at OutThereCryptids for episode posts, updates, and more. Join our community on Discord, where we dive even deeper into the mysteries we explore here on the podcast. The link can be found on our Instagram. And if you're loving the show, consider supporting us on Patreon. As a patron, you'll get exclusive perks like bonus episodes, early access, and even surprises. See you next week.